These Shallow Graves by Jennifer Donnelly. It is fourth-ish book I've reviewed of hers. Anyways, I've liked some, I have not liked others. These Shallow Graves is actually what started it all for me, and I was pleasantly pleased that I still enjoyed it. There were some things that I was like, could have been done better, but on the whole, it was great. I do feel like I'm going out of my mind because I'm like, there must be another review that I'm missing because I could have sworn I finished another book. But I think that's just because I have been procrastinating and putting off my reviews until I have 2 or 3 or whatever at a time. And I think I'm like 98% through one book and about 75-ish% through another book. So I guess in my head, I thought I was going to be reviewing one of those as well. And no, all I have is These Shallow Graves. So let's get into it. I do have my notes because, as I said, I'm almost done with 2 more books in 1 week. And I think it's been about that long since I finished this novel. To start with, I quite enjoyed the audiobook. I thought that the narrator did a great job. There were some times where I was a little bored, but on the whole, if you want to listen to the audiobook, go for it. Another note, this is a mystery, and I loved it, and it was historical, which again is what I think Jennifer Donnelly does well. Historical is her bread and butter. We have quite a cast of characters. The main character is Joe Montford, or Montford, sorry, I don't know why I said it that way. But before I jump into that, I gotta say, I didn't understand what the narration was supposed to be, because sometimes it felt like it was third person close, and sometimes it felt like an omniscient narrator. There were times that Joe was not paying attention to what another character was saying, but we knew exactly what they were saying. And then when it was kind of time for Joe to shine, we would jump into her headspace. So that's what I'm saying, is it didn't happen often, but it was one of those things that could have been tightened up in the writing, in my opinion, because if we're in her head and she's not paying attention, we should not know what this other character is saying. But Joe is a wealthy young woman in the late 1800s. She's at boarding school talking to her BFF Trudy about the article she wants to write because she enjoys journalism, even though she is in a time period where that is not something that women pursue. And not only does she want to write, but she wants to write things that matter. She wants to really dig into the heart of issues. She's interrupted because she needs to go see the headmistress. And what she gets there, 2 of her friends, this guy named Bram and his sister Adelaide Aldridge, are there to tell her that her dad has died. And jumping ahead just a smidgen here, in the aftermath, they are then tasked with kind of liquidating or selling his assets, because he owns a couple businesses. He was part of a shipping company. And to me, I'm a little confused, and this is a thing of the times, and not necessarily because Donnelly did a bad job with it, but if they sell everything that made them money, how do they have a source of income? I think her mother, Anna, probably came from some money, because that's how you did it in those times, was money married money. But I just don't understand this concept of selling everything, except that I know that women are, I guess, not technically supposed to own businesses and be the heads of things. But I was like, how do you continue to make money if you have no source of income? Anyways, that was just a little side note because it struck me as odd. She comes home and we learn that Bram is her intended. And he was a character that I needed more of. She does have another love interest, this guy named Eddie Gallagher. So we have the posh, and then we have the poor, we have the working blue collar guy, and then we have the dude that she's supposed to marry because that's what people of her set do. I thought it would have been more effective if Bram had been more of a player, because we get to know all about Eddie and fall in love with Eddie. And Bram is flat. He's just this guy that she's supposed to marry, but he actually seems like a really decent dude, because Trudy, like I was saying, earlier in the novel is just saying this is what is expected of women. We are expected to get married whether we love them or not, and the guy she's intended to marry is a jerk. And so the fact that Jo is actually going to marry someone who seems to care about her, you get the impression that they're like childhood friends, so they do know each other. But we didn't get to know Bram. And then there was an instance where we actually get to be in his presence. He doesn't necessarily believe what she's telling him, and he becomes very stereotypical. And I honestly thought, even though she asks him to keep this whole thing a secret, I really thought he was going to turn into a tattletale, and then that's where trouble was going to start. But I thought her struggle between Eddie and Bram would have hit home harder if we'd actually gotten to know Bram and gotten to decide for ourselves which one we want. I mean, it's the whole Twilight thing with Edward and Jacob, and it's like there's Team Edward, Team Jacob. Everybody has a favorite. In this book, all you really feel is that struggle of doing what's expected versus doing what she wants, which is a great struggle, but it would have been more impactful if we'd had horse in the game, you know? Her father's death is deemed an accident. And we all know this is just a farce. That's what people are gonna say, but he was cleaning his gun and it went off and he shot himself. She is having a really hard time with this, and she ends up going to his room because, or not his room, his office, I think largely because she was looking for his journal/diary, which I was, again, and this is just verbiage from the times that I thought was a little bit vague, ambiguous, where this journal is super important because it will somehow give insight into his mindset. And I guess it does because it's basically his calendar, and knowing what he had planned and knowing what future ventures he had could tell you, you know, if he's depressed and thinking about killing himself, then he probably isn't going to plan ahead. But you get the sense that it's something more personal than that, and it holds secrets. She does find this journal, and it is hidden underneath a floorboard. And then also inside this journal is a stack of money that adds up to about $1,000, which is a ton of money. I mean, still a ton of money, but it's even more money back in the 1890s. In the journal, he'd also penciled in something about a woman named Eleanor Owens. And I thought this made Jo seem a little bit oblivious because Eleanor Owens, B, and then a date. Everybody knows that stands for born. She even hypothesizes that maybe it could stand for born. And she's like, oh, could it have been a mistress? If it was a mistress, this girl's about my age, gross. This may be a love child. I don't know, but I was like, why are we questioning the B so much? It stands for born. Duh. He was a partner in a shipping company called Van Houten's Shipping. And I think it also had the word kinch. Yes, because she's thinking that this is a ship. There's these little clues and then this money, but going back to the money thing, the way she spends this money, it's like water. For me, like, you know you're rich when? When you really have no concept of money. Obviously, in some respects, she does, because she has no money of her own. She never has money to spend because it's always been a man who pays for things. Nobody just gives her an allowance and is like, hey, have fun. And so, in some respect, I know, because she's a very intelligent person. She's a really likable character. So I know that she understands, like, this money is valuable, but at the same time, she just has no concept for how much she's spending. But that's neither here nor there. She then finds a bullet kind of tucked in, like, caught up in the puddle of a curtain. And she's like, why in the world would there be a bullet over here? Now the mystery is kind of set up. The next thing that happens that really spurs her into action is, as I said, they're liquidating assets. They're selling things off. But her father had also bequeathed certain items to certain people. And one of those was a silver flask to the editor-in-chief of the newspaper that he owned. Joe convinces her driver to take her there, which, like, it's just amazing. This is why I love history, whether it is 1990s from Time After Time or it is the 1890s from These Shallow Graves. So interesting to see how different life is, and she's not allowed to do anything on her own because she's a woman. It blows my mind the way that women were regarded and treated. In any case, she convinces him to take her to the Standard. While she's there, she overhears Eddie, who is a reporter, talking about how the rumor mill is that her dad committed suicide. And so now it's just like, what in the heck? She ends up teaming up with him because she does need a man to get through things. Plus, he has contacts because he's a reporter. They begin to hunt down all these clues, like, what is the Kinch? It is not a ship. It turns out to be a man. And then who is Eleanor Owens? She then goes through all the Eleanor Owens listed in some kind of a directory. And the only one that has any potential is she gets to the house. The guy that answers the door is like, no Eleanor Owens here, leave us alone. He slams the door in her face. Then what happens is she and Eddie break into Van Houten Shipping with the help of two street urchins, and it is revealed that Eddie used to be an orphan himself. That's how he knows all these people. However, he was able to get out and forge a path for himself, create a life for himself so that he didn't face the same fate as other orphans. But they were all under this guy named the Tailor, and he's called the Tailor because he could create costumes essentially for all of these orphans so that they could fit in wherever they were, so that they could rob people blind. But Faye is the one that we really need to focus on. They get in due to this kid named Tumbler, which is also when we meet Faye. While they're in there, two guys appear. So one is one of the partners and the other is this dude that has tattoos all over his face, and he's pretty scary. They hide in a closet and they overhear a conversation. Joe realizes that Kinch is this dude and that her dad was going to be meeting Kinch and he was going to be giving him this $1,000 as bribe money. They also find a connection to this dude named Stephen Smith, who had been one of their partners, but a little over a decade earlier had been lost at sea. And they also hear the name the Bonaventure. So now they're like, oh, what is the Bonaventure? They go on this mission trying to figure out who Kinch is, what happened to Stephen Smith and why is it important, and what is the mystery behind the Bonaventure. They do encounter this one guy he's an old sailor, and he's like, it is not worth my life to tell you, but they bribe him enough for him to reveal there was something wrong with the Bonaventure. She feigns to write a book on the history of Van Houten Shipping because now, two guys have gone and people are gonna care in the future about the history of Van Houten Shipping. This is the point where she also learns about this other ship. I forget what it's called and I forget how she learned about it, but she wanted to know about this ship. She's like, hey mom, I want to write this book. I'm going to the library. Instead of going to the library, she crosses over into Brooklyn or something, which I think it's just amazing the way that the city has evolved and the areas of the city that people thought were absolutely terrible. She goes where she's not supposed to go. She talks to somebody who was involved or has knowledge of the Van Houten Shipping ships. Not before she encounters his really skeezy grandson who tries to hit on her, and it goes back to that idea of women have no worth. But she stands her own. She gives him a veiled threat, basically like, I can't call you out because that's inappropriate, but I'm gonna let you know that I know what you're doing and you better stop before something bad happens. She meets with the grandfather. The grandfather gives her enough information But of course, it's never enough. Two other partners from Van Houten Shipping murdered. Now we're thinking it's Kinch. After that first encounter when they're stuck in the closet, it's like, oh my gosh, Kinch is out for vengeance. And she eventually does, sort of a spoiler, connect him to Stephen Smith. She's like, oh my gosh, Kinch is Stephen Smith. He was abandoned and now he's back to get whoever abandoned him and all of these people who did him wrong. I gotta warn my Uncle Philip, because Uncle Philip had also been a partner in Van Houten Shipping. Next thing we know, he and one of the other partners are attacked. The other partner is murdered. He is just wounded. However, this is when Kinch / Stephen Smith is captured. He is taken to the insane asylum Darkbriar, and while at Darkbriar, he commits suicide. We also have learned that Eleanor Owens, and this is something of a spoiler as well, she had been involved with Stephen Smith. They were pledged to be married when he goes off and he dies. But he had promised her that he would come back and marry her, and he has also gotten her pregnant. He also at some point gives her some paperwork. We do not know. It's some kind of a manifest, but we don't know really what it's about, but it becomes very clear it's important to the resolution of the mystery. But she is then taken off to Darkbriar, where she eventually, I don't remember if she escaped or what, but she ends up dying. She ends up drowning, and the baby, I guess, had died as well. Should we spoil it? Should we not spoil it? Let's not spoil it just yet. Also around this time, another scary dude has shown up, and he is the scar-faced man, and he's even more sinister than Kinch. Joe comes to the conclusion that the scar-faced man is actually the one who has been killing everybody. She and Eddie are kind of bumping heads around this time because they're falling for each other, but she still is like, duty or desire. She keeps hearing things about Eddie that makes her think that he is just playing her for a story because he's waiting for his big break, and she has promised him the scoop with this whole entire thing. At one point, she is going, and there's a character named Grandmama, and I was like, whose grandmother is Grandmama? I thought it was hers, but it's actually Bram's. I think it's Grandmama's birthday. So she's there. She sees Eddie walk past with this beautiful brunette, and she's like, yeah, the rumors are true. He does not love me. So that night, Bram proposes, and kind of by omission, she says yes. So she doesn't say yes, but she doesn't say no. So now they are engaged, and she keeps flip-flopping because she's like, Bram's a good dude. I just don't love him the way I love Eddie. And then we throw into the mix this girl named Elizabeth Adams who wants Bram for herself. And so now we're like, there are things like they're at a ball. He dances with Elizabeth, and it's like, does he like her? I mean, he seems to be really into her. And so we have this whole kind of love triangle or love square going on. This causes tension between Eddie and Joe because she doesn't trust him, and now he's angry at her for kind of leading him on, and then he's like, oh, but that was my sister. Which I was just like, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about all of these mistaken instances of Eddie's duplicity. But she convinces him to continue to help her, and he also has a friend named Oscar who is a doctor in training. Oscar is one of those guys who is just ahead of his time in terms of medicine. Doctors that keep doing the autopsies, the doctors that keep doing the autopsies, I cannot say that word, autopsies, and declaring the deaths and whatnot of these guys just either aren't doing their jobs because they're lazy, or they're not doing their jobs because there's the pressure from the higher society people. Joe realizes that something that she'd heard when she and Eddie were stuck in the closet that Kinch said, when he said that the truth was written on his heart, she's like, oh my gosh, he was being literal, because they deduced that he had been among like the natives in Zanzibar or something, and there was probably some truth as to them tattooing things on his body because that's what they did, because they were savages. They dig him up. Sure enough, his story was written, or that's what it was. His story is written on his heart. And so, yes, his entire story is written on his body. We don't really know what all of it is because either due to decay or just smudging or whatever. We learn once and for all, he is Stephen Smith. He had been abandoned. Basically, he was coming back for vengeance. He was coming back to get his own. We also are starting to see that the scar-faced man, we learn who he is. He first attacks Eddie. And at this point, Joe and Eddie had already been called to the tailor. The tailor kind of bribes them into giving him information. And it turns out that the scar-faced man had been hiding in the back room the entire time. This is how he knew who Joe and Eddie were. He attacks Eddie, and then he comes after Joe, and he threatens her into stop pursuing what she's doing. She then sees a newspaper photo of Stephen Smith being handcuffed, and she's like, oh my gosh, that dude right there, that's the scar-faced man. Oscar has already told them that whoever is doing these murders behaves in such a way that he is either a police officer or he works as someone in the medical field, like a nurse or something. And so we're like, okay, that's the scar-faced man, and his name is Francis Mallon. And we connect him to Eleanor Owens, we connect him to Stephen Smith, and I think there's one other person that he's connected to, but I'm just like, this is when I feel like Joe is being a little obtuse. Because he's the common denominator, and he is a hospital worker. He works at the insane asylum. This mystery is figured out. It's figured out that he's the one who's actually doing the murders, because why would Kinch be murdering these people when he wants to blackmail them into giving him money? Nothing will come of him killing them. And also, he is right-handed versus left-handed, so some of these murders he just couldn't have committed. The night that they go and dig up Stephen Smith, they're on their way back, and Bram comes along in his carriage, and he's like, what's going on with you? And why are you with these two dudes? She gets into the carriage with him. She's like, I'm gonna tell you everything. And I was just like, why are we telling him everything? Because I'm here, my naturally suspicious mind, and I would think she would, in some shape, form, or fashion, have a suspicious mind too, because of all these murders that are happening. No, she's like, I can trust Bram, even though we've had nothing about Bram to know if he's trustworthy or not. And this is the moment I mentioned earlier. He is like, you are insane. And so this is when I'm like, you are a stereotype, and you're just gonna go run to her uncle the first chance you get. He actually doesn't. He surprises me. But what she does is, to preempt the possibility of him going to her uncle, she wakes up early the next day and she goes to her uncle. And not only does she tell him everything, because she'd been lying about Eddie and Oscar, she had said that she'd hired a private detective, and I guess because Bram had seen Eddie and she had mentioned Oscar because he kind of walked off a little bit, she saw no point in continuing to lie about them. If you are following along with where I'm going, you know where this is going. The next thing we know, Uncle Philip, and then she gives him the only proof that she has, which I believe is the diary. Eleanor Owens and Stephen Smith had both had a half of a heart. Each one had the other person's name on it. They'd found that on Stephen Smith's body. She turns that over, and then she had one other piece of evidence, which I can't remember. It's not really important. So yeah, she tells him everything, and she gives him everything she has that can prove her story, which I'm just like, you are so dumb. I mean, I know it makes the story more interesting and it throws a wrench in the mix, But I kept waiting for her to, because Eddie has already thrown out there, should you really be trusting everybody in your circle? Look at all of the deaths of these people connected to your father, connected to the shipping company. There's somebody that you should not be trusting. Do you know who that is? Tell me who you think that is. Well, I'll tell you, it is Uncle Philip. The next thing she knows, Uncle Philip has convinced her mother that she is going insane because all of this has led to dark thoughts. She needs to go to Darkbriar. She is on their way there, and Uncle Philip lets it slip about the location that Stephen Smith had gone to. This was not something they could read on him because it had been blurred. And so this is when she's like, oh my gosh, my uncle is a murderer. This is when I say, it's not been a bad mystery so far. I've enjoyed the twists and the turns and the layers and the misdirection, but I needed more breadcrumbs pointing to Uncle Stephen. I don't mind being surprised. I don't mind being like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that? But it felt like it came out of left field because there was nothing pointing to him except for one comment made by Eddie. And then apparently Uncle Philip had a hole in his pocket. This is how she deduced the bullet got in the curtains, was because he had hidden there after he killed his brother and the bullet fell out. And there's this whole, in my opinion, kind of a convoluted explanation about the bullets, but I was like, so there's two things that say that Uncle Philip was the bad guy the entire time. Except for me, because I'm just like, well, one, I don't know, it's because of a very, very vague recollection from the last time I read this, but I was just like, you know what, I think it's Uncle Philip. He's just too good of a guy. But I wanted those breadcrumbs. Odd behavior, maybe. Things that aren't adding up, or maybe his name is turning up in places that just make her think, or make us think, but are innocuous, like things that don't really stand out, because it makes sense that his name would be on these documents related to his business. You know, they get to the asylum, and he, at this point, has realized that she knows. And who do you think is there to greet him? The Scarface man, Francis Mallon himself. She's like, if they take me, because of course the warden, whatever her name is, she's like, oh, well, of course she'll only have female attendants, but when we intake patients, we always like to have the male nurses help us out just in case. And she knows. She's like, that's not what's going to happen, because she knows that he killed Stephen Smith, and her fate is going to be the exact same thing because they have to get rid of her. She is able to escape. Although, can I just say, this reminded me of, I believe it was the Home for Unwanted Girls, or maybe it was The Key. It was one of those. And I'll just have to link them both here so you can go figure out which one it is. It's the whole idea of young women getting pregnant before they're allowed to, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, and so they're sent off to a home to have their babies. And the nuns that run these homes for women and children are just so uncaring and unfeeling and vicious. I felt like this woman was also that stereotype, which I'm sure she has to be hardened to some extent because of everything she sees. But I was just like, I don't know, it bothered me that this young woman, this well-bred young woman, is the one who she is going to not believe. I mean, I get it. She's being committed by her male uncle, who has more power than anybody because he's a man, and then he's wealthy. On some level, I wanted her to have a little bit of compassion. We don't see her enough for it to matter. In any case, Jo escapes. She is pursued by her uncle and by Mallon. And this, I was like, oh my gosh, you're so dumb yet again. And it bothers me because we all saw it coming. It was kind of stereotypical. It was a cliche. She runs to the woods. She uses misdirection via her shoe, thinking that both men are going to follow her misdirection. Only her uncle follows her misdirection. She is then caught by, or almost caught by, Malin, who's pissed because she broke his nose. She's able to get away from him. She escapes into the basement of this other random building. She's able to slip inside an open window. And I'm like, what is this place? So I was a little disoriented in terms of setting. It turns out to be the men's ward to some capacity. She finally makes it up the stairs and she's like, I just have got to find Eddie and Oscar. This will all be okay. I'm like, look, girl, you told your uncle absolutely everything. In this span of time, don't you think that he has gone and taken care of Eddie and Oscar? It's not hard for him to find them. Don't rely on them. Like, figure it out for yourself. But she's bound and determined. And in my head, I'm like, you know what? She's gonna find them in this men's asylum. I was wrong. She didn't. But she does get caught. Her uncle and Malin are arguing about what to do because Malin's like, we just need to kill her here. And her uncle's like, that will look too suspicious. Next thing she knows, she hears the cocking of a gun and she's like, oh, this is it. It turns out to be Faye. Faye shoots Malin in the leg / knee, and she does the same thing for Philip. And she's like, let's get out of here. Before she's willing to go, Joe is like, I need the full story. Here, biggest spoilers. Mad Mary is Faye's mother. Mad Mary is Eleanor Owens. She had not died, but somehow she had gotten out of this insane asylum. Francis Malin and Uncle Philip had been in cahoots at least that long. What, 15 years? He had been tasked with getting rid of the baby. He, I guess, has enough of a conscience. I don't know why I get those mixed up. He has enough of a conscience. I'm sorry. That's so embarrassing. I'm a writer. Why do I get those two mixed up? Back to the point. Enough of a conscience to swap her out with the corpse of another baby. Faye is then sold to the tailor. And at this point in the story, Faye has then also been sold because she's getting too old to do the job anymore because she's being recognized and she's getting caught. She has then been sold to a madam, but that's neither here nor there. He reveals that the Bonaventure was actually a slave ship. And at this point, slavery had been outlawed, but they had done it, her father included, because Van Houten Shipping was going under. They just didn't have enough money. They had pretended that one ship that I can't remember the name of, that she had gone to the dude in Brooklyn for, they had pretended that it had sunk, only to then rebrand it as the Bonaventure. It had been using it as a slave ship, but when they were kind of in dire straits, they had brought Stephen Smith on to help them out, to invest in it. It still wasn't what they needed, so they come up with the Bonaventure. Stephen Smith is like, something's not right here. He gets hold of the manifest, which is what reveals the true nature of the Bonaventure. This is the point that Philip takes things in his own hands. Charles, Joe's dad, knew about the slave ship, but he did not know that Philip had